This is episode number 77 featuring David Leffel. Welcome to the Plein Air podcast from Plein Air Magazine. I'm your host, Eric Rhodes, publisher and founder of Plein Air Magazine. In the Plein Air podcast, we dive into the world of outdoor painting called plein air painting. For those who don't know, plein air is a French term meaning outdoors or the open air. The French say plein air, others pronounce it plein air, but no matter how you say it, it's a huge movement of artists around the world who are going outdoors to paint. This show is about this movement. Podcast is also brought to you by Plein Air Magazine's Fall Color Week. It's a painter's retreat to Banff and Lake Louise in the Canadian Rockies. It's North America's best kept secret. Wow, it's amazing. You'll come for a week of painting and leave with a lot of beautiful paintings, meet a lot of great friends, and we encourage you to look into it. You can learn more at fallcolorweek.com. And it's my desire to see more people fall in love with plein air painting. You can help by sharing this podcast with your friends on social media or email. And we hope you'll subscribe on iTunes when it comes to you, so it comes to you every week. And if you haven't got our ebook, 240 Tips on Plein Air Painting by some of the top painters in the world, you can pick it up for free at pleinairtips.com. And of course, if you need to reach me or have feedback, send me an email, eric@pleinairmagazine.com. The interview is also brought to you by the Figurative Art Convention in Miami this November 7th through 10th. We have top artists to teach you and to work with you. And our guest later in a minute was there last year. This is the conference for the realist movement, the chance to become part of a thriving community of artists and sculptors. It's our second year of this conference, and last year we left everybody with improved painting skills and inspiration and a lot of new friends. It's a week of artist teaching and working with you. Check out the faculty at figurativeartconvention.com. We're recording this live in front of a live audience today at the Plein Air Convention in Santa Fe. We have a very special guest, David Leffel, and David is not necessarily known as a plein air painter, but he is a plein air painter. David, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Eric.
So for those who don't know, of course, David is a legend in the art world, has just done amazing things with his career. And David, I thought we'd kind of talk about that. There was a documentary recently that was done on your life. It kind of starts with the beginnings of your life. Why don't you help us understand what you went through as a child and then how you became an artist?
Well, I actually started drawing before I went into the hospital. I went into the hospital at 3.5 to 4 years old with a bone disease, which there was no cure for at the time. But prior to my actually going into the hospital, I had started drawing from life. My mother told me one of the first things I drew was my father's hat. And of course, going into the hospital gave me a lot of opportunity and time to draw. So I went in, as I said, approximately 3.5 to 4 years old and stayed till I was 7.
Wow.
And I guess the osteo had gone into remission, so I was actually home from 7 years old to 8 years old.
Uh-huh.
And wearing a brace, I think, and then my wound started suppurating again, producing pus, and I went back into the hospital at 8 and didn't get out till I was 15.
So you spent most of your youth in a hospital?
Yeah. Yes.
And were you able to see your parents frequently, or were you far away from them?
Well, the first years, the 4 to 7 years, I have very little recollection of seeing my parents. As I say, very little. But from 8 years on, my memories are quite strong, and the Essential Hospital, the main hospital for joint diseases, was on, I think, 123rd Street and Madison Avenue, where they performed all the surgeries.
Right.
And after the surgeries, we went to a convalescent home in Far Rockaway. And so that's where I spent most of my formative years.
Do you have any idea how many surgeries you had?
I think I had 7, possibly 8 major surgeries.
So that must have been frightening as a child.
It wasn't the surgery so much, Eric, that was frightening. It was going under ether.
Yeah.
Ether, which was the anesthesia of choice then. The experience of going under and losing consciousness, slowly losing control, was really more scary than the actual surgeries,
Right.
which of course were painless since I was under sedation, complete sedation. And coming out of ether also was terrible because you were completely dry, your mouth was and you just craved water. And of course, the water made you throw up. So It was a way of getting rid of the after effects of the ether, but it was unpleasant. But as I say, my worst nightmares were going under, the experience of going under ether.
So I'm just curious if you know that same disease, if a child gets that disease today, are they able to cure it?
Within a week, usually.
Really?
With penicillin or a penicillin derivative.
Really?
Yeah. Back then, the only drug they had was the sulfur drug, sulfathiazine or sulfathiazole. And you could only take it for a very limited time because it would destroy, I think, your red blood corpuscles.
Oh, my.
So the only thing was to either let the disease run its course or to operate, clean out the wound, and immobilize you. I was in a cast from my chest to my toe.
Oh, my.
My chest to my right toe.
Well, it probably seemed like forever at the time.
Children, as they say, adapt very easily, and it really wasn't. It wasn't really what you would think unpleasant. It was just the way it was. I mean, we just accepted it. All the other children in the hospital who had diseases which lasted, a long time, like there was Perthes disease or slip epiphysis, bone TB.
Mm-hmm. So did you, was there a sense of a community at the hospital? Did you have school classes and make other friends there?
Oh, yeah, because most of us were in there for the long term. It was, always years, and of course, some children went home, others died, so that was, the coming and going was kind of a common.
So that had to be a pretty stark reality for a young boy to experience friends who were passing.
Yeah,
but hard.
It was very different than when I came home and going to funerals of relatives. It was just something that took place. And
so how do you think that had an influence in forming you, forming your personality, forming your artistic sensibilities?
Well, the one thing, of course, that made it very different was not having role models.
Yeah.
Because, of course, during the war, a lot of it, the time I spent was the Second World War, so a lot of the nurses left the hospital, I guess, to serve. We had a lot of so-called nurses who really weren't nurses, who would take your pulse without a watch or in the dark. They were just nurses in name only. But basically, so not having role models like your parents or relatives, I think kind of you had to survive on your own and figure things out on your own, which there was no authority really to look up to, so to speak.
So, what age did your parents live till?
Well, my father only lived till 57.
And so were you out of the hospital and able to live at home with your parents?
Yeah. When I came home, I actually
Right.
Yes, did. I was, 15 or 16 years old when I came home.
Okay, so you at least had some of that experience.
Yeah, I did have some of that experience.
And were there any artistic influences from your parents? Did they have any exposure to art or expose you in any way?
No. It was, the closest was opera. My mother loved, and my father loved opera. But in terms of going to museums or galleries or thinking of painting in a particular way was really non-existent.
So what are your first memories in terms of realizing that art was art, that it was something that you might be interested in? You were drawing, and we honored you with a Lifetime Achievement Award, and in the video they showed a drawing you had done of Joe DiMaggio at a young age. But did you realize at the time what was out there? Had you ever been exposed to it? You probably hadn't seen a museum or anything at that point.
No, but of course there were other children who drew as well, or drew in the hospital like me, and we would have drawing contests to see who could copy something, the best, or make up things. We'd make up comic strips, and but I never, for me it was so natural. I thought anybody could do this. It was.
What happened then? You got out of the hospital, you moved back in with your parents. What happened after that?
Well, I went to high school.
Oh, you did?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think I started in third term high school. And of course, that was very difficult because in the hospital we had teachers coming, from bed to bed. So it was, because children were all different ages. So
they taught you one at a time.
One at a time. And then going into the high school, I did Erasmus Hall High School with about 3,000 students and 25 or 30 students in a class was overwhelming. I just didn't know how to deal with it.
Socially, you didn't have any exposure to any of that to get used to it.
And coming home actually was really not a pleasant experience because I didn't have any friends. I didn't know anything about life. It was like coming from another planet, going into a restaurant or diner and having to place an order and eat, and it was so different from being served hospital food, whatever.
Yeah, it's almost like being in a time warp or something and then showing up in reality.
Yeah, it really was, and not knowing anybody.
Yeah, that must have been very painful.
That was, really was painful, a painful time.
So you went into high school, art at that point. Was there any art class or exposure?
Yeah, there was, major art classes, and that was really my only exposure, to having, in a major art class, other people who drew or painted, but minimal amount of art, let's say, in terms of capital A art.
Yeah. So how do you go from that to deciding to become an artist and go to art school?
Well, when I graduated, I thought I would go to NYU. Was my first thought, and possibly study art or teaching. And I actually went, registered, or whatever you do to find out what classes you can attend. Then I realized that I didn't have a head for studying. It was too confining. So my best friend at the time was going to Parsons School of Design. Though actually I did take a test for test for Cooper Union, and I passed the intelligence test, but I failed the art test.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, there's no hope for you.
No hope. and then I applied to Pratt, but I also failed their art test. And as I said, my best friend, Richie Harrison, was going to Parsons, and Parsons didn't have an admission test. You paid a fee and you enrolled.
So everybody got admitted.
So everybody got admitted.
So what was the state of, what year would that have been?
That would have been 1950, I believe.
Yeah, so the world was already enamored with modernism.
Yes.
Is that why you failed the test to the other two, because they were more interested in abstract?
Well, no, I think part of the Cooper Union test had one of the questions on the test was to design a roadside restaurant, and they told you how many stools, how many booths. It was really an architecture, a floor plan, and then a facade.
Right.
And I had no conversance with any of that.
Sure.
So
You hadn't had any exposure to any of that.
none exposed.
Yeah.
So questions like that really didn't have to just do with drawing.
So you went from Parsons then to what, Art Students League?
No, I went from Parsons into advertising.
Oh, you did? So you
Yeah.
became a graphic designer?
Eventually, I mean, I started out just doing paste ups and mechanicals.
Yeah.
The lowest rung, and I actually, about 3 weeks after graduating, I went with a friend of mine to California because he had heard, one of my friend who was a student at Parsons, he had heard there were multiple easy jobs out in Los Angeles.
Right.
And so we jumped in his Buick. He taught me how to drive on the road, driving to California.
Right.
And we landed in Los Angeles, but could not get a job. I mean, whoever told him that jobs were plentiful was wrong.
And that was in the advertising industry. So do you remember the name of the agency that you worked for when you first worked?
Well, I came back to New York, yes. We got a job drafting.
Okay.
He had done some draft. He had gone to Parsons on a veteran scholarship and had done drafting before. So we both got a job drafting, which lasted, for me, about 6 months.
You talked, when you made your acceptance speech on stage, you talked about, you used the word something like a life of slavery, meaning slavery not in the traditional form,
No.
but working in a regular job. Was that when you first realized that?
No, when I came back to New York and actually started working for, actual advertising agency, which I did like. I mean, I liked the work, and I felt if you had to have a job, advertising was the best
Right.
job. There was a lot of freedom in the bullpen. But coming back from lunch was, as I said in the documentary, or in my acceptance speech, was like going to jail. Here I was out on the street with hordes of people,
Right.
back and forth, whatever they were doing, and I had to go back to my drawing board.
Right.
It seemed very, very confining. As I said, like
What kind of things were you drafting back then?
Well, this in New York, I was doing, paste ups, mechanicals, and I was doing spot drawings, and then eventually illustration. So as I said, it was a great job, but it was just the confinement
Right.
of it.
And how long do you think you did that?
I did it about 5 years,
Yeah.
maybe 4 years working for someone, and then about a year freelancing.
Okay.
And that's what got me into the idea of painting.
Okay. So let's talk about that transition. So you started studying with someone at that point?
No, I was painting at night. I had moved in with two musicians from Juilliard who had a 6-room apartment on Amsterdam Avenue and 88th Street in New York. And being with them, they were going to Juilliard studying piano and composition. It just introduced me to a different world of people. Instead of suits and advertising, it was
Right.
a more artistic crowd. And we used to hang out in a coffee shop up on Broadway and 93rd Street, and with other musicians. Basically, most of the people I knew, friends, were musicians. But I used to go in with a sketchbook and draw. And one of the waiters, Elias Rivera, who he lives here in Santa Fe, was going to the Art Students League, and he would look over my shoulder and watch what I was drawing, and eventually said, you know, I think you would like to study with my teacher, Frank Mason. And that's how I got eventually to the Art Students League.
Wow. What a legend, Frank Mason.
Frank Mason.
Now, he was a pretty young man at that time.
I guess so. You know,
It didn't seem like it to you.
it didn't seem like it
So
to
you're
me.
probably 19 or 20 at the time? 25?
Oh, no. I was in maybe about 24.
Yeah, so he's probably in his
25.
40s or 50s at that time, right?
Yes.
Because he lived till but maybe about 5 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So what do you think the influences of Frank Mason were in your skills?
Well, the one thing, you know, I had never, went into early, I'd never been to a museum until I was at Parsons, and
Right.
then the teachers would take us to the Museum of Modern Art or the Metropolitan Museum, where,
Right.
of course, I saw my first old master paintings, my first Rembrandts,
Right.
and I was so unworldly, let's say, so green and innocent that I thought that nobody painted like that anymore, that these were old masters, and this was a lost art. As I said, now it seems hard for me to even get into that mindset, but I thought this was something that people did back in the 17th, 18th century, and nobody knew how to do it anymore.
Right.
But it did make a deep impression on me, that especially Rembrandt.
Yeah. I was going to say Rembrandt was the biggest influence on. You said Rembrandt and who else?
Well, mainly Rembrandt. I mean,
Rembrandt.
I loved, the Velasquez, the Van Dycks, I thought were incredible, all of the, Rubens. But Rembrandt made the strongest, deepest impression on me because of the way he used light.
And do you remember the painting, the first one you saw?
No. Any one of them.
Anyone
one of
would
the-
work.
I mean, the Met does have a great collection of
Absolutely.
Rembrandts.
Yeah. Have you seen the Rembrandt collection at the Hermitage?
No.
Yeah, I think they have something like 27 of them.
Yeah.
It's pretty remarkable.
Well, but in Amsterdam and Rotterdam and The Hague,
Oh, yeah.
they also have
they have
an
a huge
incredible-
collection.
Huge collection.
Yeah. So if you had a chance to sit down with Rembrandt today, you've obviously studied him, and you've tried to learn from watching what he's done. But is there any one particular thing that you would ask him that you haven't figured out?
No, I would really just want to watch him,
Yeah. Wouldn't that be swell?
just to watch him.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, as I said yesterday, to the people who attended, it's really the way he thinks is what's important, not so much his technique, but that's what I would love to see how he applied paint and what the consistency of the paint was,
Right.
surfaces, but the way he thinks, or Velasquez, or whoever, you feel akin to, it's really their thought process more than their technique that's important.
Right. So talk to me about thought process. What kind of a thought process do you go through when you're trying to decide what you're going to paint and what decisions you're making about that painting?
Well, in every painting, there are certain givens, before you start, whether you're painting a landscape, a still life, or a portrait, or a figure painting. For example, your composition is either going to be at eye level and you're going to work across the canvas from left to right. In other words, the canvas has a reed to it.
Right.
So it'll either be, if you're at eye level, where you're not getting a deep sense of perspective, it's either going to read from left to right or right to left. So whether you're arranging a figure, an anatomical object, so to speak, or landscape objects, still life objects, you know immediately for what you want that painting to be. If it's at eye level, you're going to read from left to right or right to left. If you're above eye level and looking down on your subject like a hillside, you're arranging your objects, your movement through the canvas from near to far, in and out, because you can see the perspective. So at eye level, your model will be eye level. It has to be a long pose or upright pose because you don't have any depth. Whereas if you're above eye level, you can arrange different kinds. So you have that in your mind, regardless of, as a landscape, you're going to have a little land, big sky picture, or the other way, big land, less sky picture.
Right.
So you have certain givens because of how you want to arrange your objects on the canvas.
Well, composition is one of the most difficult things, I think, for people to really understand. A lot of artists will use the golden mean or some theory like that, dividing their canvas into thirds and squares or whatever. Do you have any particular preferences or thoughts on that, or are rules made to be broken?
Well, I think it's an artificial rule, Eric, to impose that kind of a grid, the golden rule, which we did study in Parsons. The thing that's really you want to decide first, regardless of whether your composition is across or in and out of your painting, is what your center or area of interest will be in the painting.
Right.
That's the most important thing. What's worthy of painting to be interesting enough for you to paint and for another human being. And then the next step is how you're going to lead the person to that point. So dividing your composition artificially or saying, I have to make this square, I need another square, or triangle, or circle, it has nothing to do with what you want to arrange, trees, rocks, flora, fauna, to get to that center of interest. And then how fast or slow you want the eye to travel through the space to get to that point is how you pick what you're going to put into your picture to get, and how strong you're going to emphasize each thing, so you can have one continuous movement of interest like a crescendo in music, or you can start it, build up to a certain point like a melody, drop it off a little, build it up. So you pick your objects as a still life objects, landscape, plein air objects, anatomical objects, and how much interest in terms of paint quality or color, you're going to put that quadrant, so to speak, to get to the center of interest. So that's really composing rather than, as they artificially saying, a golden mean or grids or whatever.
So is that pretty much what you decide first? Once you decide your subject matter, you look at the rhythm of the painting?
Yes, yeah. If you want, if you're doing a figure and you want the main interest to be on the face, and then go to the right hand or the left hand or whatever, then you just decide on how. For example, if I'm looking out, with the left side of my face, but I want the hands in, and I have the light travel down my face to this shoulder, then maybe drop off on the near hand, because that's a given, and have the strongest light on my far hand, and then how many folds or wrinkles or whatever, or anatomy to build up faster to get to whatever in this case, right hand is doing.
Right.
how much, holding something or whatever, but just that you decide on the path you want the eye to travel and then decide on how fast you want the eye to get. It's very rational, just like an author. You have once upon a time and the end, and then how many characters and plots or subplots, rather, you're going to pace the viewer's mind to get to that point. Well, the artist is doing the exact same thing. It's be very fast movement. You could have, for example, if an arm, you can have a lot of anatomy, and each piece of anatomy very well delineated. So the eye has to appreciate each piece that you've painted to that finished degree before it gets to the fingers. Or you can keep this very subtle and not just barely enough anatomy so that the hand becomes that much more important. So you read down the arm much quicker. Very logical.
Some painters will, they'll take their focal point, and in their focal point they'll put their darkest dark, their lightest light, their most chroma, their sharpest edges. Is that something that you think about doing?
Not in those terms. I just think of one thing I do. It has to be intricate enough. Your center of interest, whatever is there, has to have enough intricacy of, let's say, detail, though I don't like that word, but enough that you could put paint there in an interesting way that it's compelling to look at. It can't just be like if you painted a white vase, just a white vase, the expanse of white isn't interesting.
Right.
It becomes, so a pattern or design on the vase makes it that much. There's something for the mind to feast on visually and focus on. So whether it's copse of trees or grasses or running, a stream, water, the center of interest has something that you can put paint down in an interesting way. It can't be broad. It has to be fine, the impasto or the color, as you say, the contrast, just little things that are happening to make that more compelling to look at.
One of the things that I have always found fascinating about your paintings is the aesthetic. There's a rare quality of exceptional taste, the tendency to, your paintings tend to be relatively dark, but they really draw you in, and then you have this sense of drama. But talk to me a little bit about aesthetics, and how do you know when you're hitting the right taste mark?
Oh, that's a difficult question, because that's something that, again, as I tried to say yesterday, that along with learning to paint, you're also developing your taste and your sensitivity levels, but it also has to do with, I guess, how you live your life in general, that you can't just cross a threshold into your studio after beating your wife or kicking the cat, and whatever.
When did you stop beating your wife?
When I found Sherry was stronger than I was. But in other words, so how you live your life, you're developing your taste, your sensitivity, and as you understand painting more or anything, that the more in depth, the more you go into anything in depth, any worthwhile field, it has ramifications. So you let's say and so the ramifications are you develop as a human being, which, you develop a sensitivity towards people, towards whatever you do,
So it's what you're surrounding yourself with as well. I remember when you painted my portrait, you painted it 2 different times. And I think I remember one time we were listening to jazz.
Yeah.
Is that what you listened to?
Well, I listen to classical music, opera, but I love jazz and old jazz and certainly old blues,
Right,
from the
right.
40s, 30s, 20s.
Yeah, I love that too.
Because there was more, I don't know, more human feeling in it. You know, the people actually lived what they were going through in a different way, where today it's, you know, blues are totally different, you know, acoustic and...
Well, country music stars, you know, they sing about their woes and the troubles they've had, and so and I guess that's kind of what we're doing as artists, is we're interpreting our lives and the things that we've gone through in our lives. Is that something that you try to put into your work?
Well, no.
Okay.
You know, no. I mean, I just the phrase. I don't think you don't try to put it into your life.
It's just there. Makes sense. Okay. Why do you teach?
If you put it in, it's like it becomes a self-conscious process.
Right.
You know, and that, as I said, after the invention of the camera and the tin tube, art went from a problem-solving discipline into a discipline of self-expression. And of course, and that's what you hear in terms of modern art. And of course, even people have to express themselves.
So let's go there for a second, because that's an interesting topic. The time that you grew up as an artist, you're trying to make it as an artist, representational art was pretty much out of vogue.
Yes.
And so what was that like for you and your fellow artists? It must have been very discouraging.
Well, one thing I used to hear a lot, which, as you said, could be very discouraging, was, it's all been done before. You know, why are you doing that? It's all been done before. You know, and get with it. You know, this is the 60s or 70s, you know, progress and all, you know, that was happening. And why are you painting such old-fashioned pictures that, as I said, it's all... So it was always a downer to hear that kind of talk. And I would just reassure myself, well, this is what I like to do.
Right.
So
how would you answer that question when they say, you know, it's all been done before?
I had no answers at the time. I certainly didn't know then what I know now to argue the point, but I just would talk to myself and say, you dumb. What do you know?
So this is a big issue for a lot of artists. A lot of artists don't understand why the world is embracing modern art or abstract modernism or various forms of exhibition art and so on. And it's discouraging for them to see, you know, $80 and $100 million prices going to certain painters and formaldehyde sharks and things of that nature. What do you say to the painters who are living in this world of representational art and trying to survive in it, trying to make a living, and you know, you're still bucking the system. The system is still mostly the modern art world, although it seems to be kind of edging a little bit more towards representational again.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind was, strangely enough, Polonius' advice to Laertes in Hamlet, where he says at the end, to thine own self be true.
Right.
And it depends, you know, what you're in it for also, Eric. As I've said, you know, I never thought of learning to paint as also pursuing a career, you know, and the notoriety, fame, money, whatever, you know, goes with a career was really secondary or tertiary to me. And so everybody has to make their own decision in those terms, you know, how much pursuing a career as an artist or a painter it's very, definition of terms, I would say, to pursuing a career as a painter, you can't pursue a career as an artist by my definition of the difference between an artist and a painter. So, but, I can't say for other human beings, if you want a career, you do certain things, you say certain things, cultivate certain people. It's a whole different thing than just trying to learn to paint. Everybody has to answer to themselves what's important to them. For me, learning to paint was the most important.
So you went through a huge process of learning to paint. And of course, most of it is just about brush time. But we have so many people who are listening, who are trying to figure this out, trying to know how to paint. Having gone through what you went through, a lot of it was struggle. You talked about being hungry. You talked about being cold.
All the classical
things. Are they necessary in the process?
No.
All right.
No. I mean, you don't have. You don't have to suffer.
You don't have to suffer.
You don't have to.
That's good news.
And for me, it really wasn't suffering because it was a choice I made. It's different if maybe circumstances impinge themselves on you, but I always felt I could have gotten a job. I could have, lived a different. I could have gone back into advertising. So it really wasn't suffering.
You had a backup if you needed it.
Well, because it was doing what I wanted to do.
Right.
It's different than if you're, as I say, you're impinged on and whatever you feel that you're not cause, you're rather effect. I mean, human beings are always happiest when they're cause rather than effect.
Right.
So if suffering means you feel like you're cause, you're effect, you're not in control. Whereas what I went through of, being cold, hungry, whatever circumstance, I was still cause.
Right.
I was in control of it. So
Right.
The word suffering really doesn't really apply in that sense.
So what's the track? If you were advising somebody came to you and they said, listen, I'm starting painting today, and I want to accomplish as much as I possibly can, starting with technique, understanding how to manipulate paint and so on, and then getting to the point where I'm able to actually express what I'm trying to feel. What's that process like today? How do you recommend people do it?
Well, for me to tell someone else what to do, as I said, I just couldn't tell. And somebody asking, it's like friends who are actors, or I guess any profession, who would say, how do I do this? Well, that's already the wrong question.
Okay. What's the right question?
You just do it.
You just figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if that's
how do I become an actor? Well, it's the wrong mindset.
But if that were the case, I don't mean to debate you or disagree, but if that were the case, you wouldn't be teaching.
Well, I'm teaching painting. I'm not teaching how they should live their life, in other words.
Right. But if somebody wants to become a painter, what would that process look like?
They'd have to learn to paint. And the first thing in painting, the most important thing I think you can learn, which took me personally a year and a half to learn, was how to make a brushstroke.
A year and a half? Yeah.
Yeah, I had in Parsons, which was very, very heavily balanced towards rendering, really fine control, making color charts, which doesn't apply in painting, but everything, a little color, an inch by a half inch, and spacing them on or doing lettering where you would learn how to flow the ink so it didn't leave brush strokes. And painting was like very fine blending and rendering. So when I wanted to learn to paint, my teacher, Eugene Bielbien, would say, make brush strokes. Well, I had, as I've said, I had a brush, I had paint on the brush, and I was putting the brush down on the surface, and I thought I was making brushstrokes, but I was blending everything smooth, as Parsons sort of dictated that whole background. And Beale would say, make brushstrokes. Well,
So is that to be interpreted as make the stroke and leave it alone?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lay it down and don't touch it.
As I said, it took me about a year and a half before it clicked,
Yeah.
and
Well,
I made a whole painting.
So when I was watching you painting yesterday on stage, I noticed how deliberate you were with your brushstrokes. I noticed that you were, first off, you spent a lot of time mixing color. You weren't in a hurry. And then you looked at it, you stared at it, you studied it, and then you made a very deliberate stroke. There was no rushing about it, I thought.
Yeah.
Is that pretty accurate?
Yes. Yeah. If you take your time, you have all the time in the world. But if you rush, you never have enough time.
Right, because you're always correcting mistakes.
Yeah.
Right?
But the thing is, it's making a brushstroke, what it implies, I mean, it has so much depth rather than just the physical act, because what it implies is that you're looking and you're seeing something specific. So your perception is keen, fine, and the brush stroke you make is describing something specific. So either practicing the brush strokes will make your seeing, your perception more specific, or seeing more specific things to describe, your brushstroke follows. But it's a perception, and it's also a physical act, and feeling the paint, so that the sensual quality of the paint, what it feels like under your brush and the surface, is important, as well as that you're developing your keenness of perception.
Excellent advice. I'm going to work on that when I get home.
Yeah, well, as I've said, your whole life is in every brushstroke.
You're known for the last brushstroke you made, right?
Well, it's in the moment. You see, you have to be keen, aware. So all your senses are heightened. Your perception, your awareness is heightened in that moment, you see. And then it's also, you see the ramifications. It's also the surface you're painting, whether it's a rock, a tree, a leaf, a field, so that how fast or slow you make that brushstroke, you're in tune with that branch, how fast or slow it's coming out of the trunk, different trees, different anatomy of trees. So it's that one-to-one perception, so it means you're alive.
A lot of people have kind of pigeonholed you as a portrait painter or a figurative painter, and of course, you're the best. But your landscape painting is unbelievably beautiful. Did you do or have you done a lot of plein air work? I know you did a lot of sketching.
Well, yeah, I did at one time. In fact, when I first started at the League with Mason, it was at the end of a term. I guess it must have been like April or May, and then the League, Mason would go up to Vermont and teach landscape painting there. But I went to Vermont, but I studied with one of his students, or a Dumont student, Frank Maione, who was a fabulous landscape painter. Unfortunately, died too young of AIDS, when it was. But I studied with Bob Maione, and Bob, as it was amazing because he could be we could be at home. We roomed together at that period, and he would make landscapes up out of his head. He had all the flora and fauna cataloged in his mind, and he could do a winter scene, snow scene or a summer scene. A beautiful paint and beautiful compositions. And I studied, so before I really got into Frank Mason, I studied with Bob Maione.
So was there anything that comes to mind that was especially helpful that he taught you?
No, it was really, I think, watching him.
Just observation.
Observation. And finally, I did do one landscape. It was a hill, and something clicked. It was like an epiphany. And all of a sudden, I saw how all the grasses and stuff that made up this hill were part of the movement of this slope downhill. And it just started to make sense to me.
Observation is one of the better ways of learning. Don't you agree?
It's the only way.
Yeah.
Because when I threw myself out of Frank's class, we had a big disagreement, so to speak, not verbal, but he ruined one of my paintings. Anyhow, I had to learn on my own. I didn't feel I had really learned what I wanted to learn, and observation was the only thing I had left.
Right.
I didn't know anyone else I wanted to study with, so I had to try to figure it out.
Sure. And nature is a wonderful teacher, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Well, what I did, Eric, like I was in my studio trying to learn how to paint, and then I would look at myself and I'd say, I know my nose is, let's say, 3/4 or a ½ inch further in front of my cheek. How do I know that visually? Is it color, value? Is it edges, overlapping? So I would have to figure out how I knew something, what it was, and then how to translate that into paint, and then figure what if there were any principles or rational things that made sense instead of just being able to do it that one time.
Do you ever use photography as a reference?
Only if I have to do a portrait of someone who's deceased.
Yeah. I once visited somebody who was doing a portrait of someone who was deceased, and he said the only way he could do it was to sculpt the person. So he would sculpt a bust first from photographs, and then he would paint from the bust.
Oh,
I thought that was an interesting approach.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah. So now you have to learn sculpture.
Well, what I do, as opposed to your friend, when I have a photograph of someone, I try to imagine, instead of matching, the values or what's happening in the photograph, I try to imagine what the person must have looked like in actuality, in a sense, in my head sculpting.
And that's
maybe.
so hard from a photograph.
And excerpting, this is what the camera saw, but this is what a human being must look like if this is. So it's like taking the camera out of the picture and imagining what the person looked like without, in actuality rather than.
Well, and some of that has to be with years of experience of painting the human face and the skin, and knowing that there's certain traits that every face has and so on that you're not going to find in a photograph.
Yeah. And actually, when I was still in advertising and doing album covers.
Really?
And I did a lot of black musicians, jazz musicians, and I could tell just from a black and white photograph what their complexion was, which
Right.
black skin has enormous variety in terms of like light yellow, red.
I've been practicing that a lot lately.
Yeah.
I've been working with black models, and it's really interesting, the colors that keep coming up that I never imagined were there.
Yeah, much more variety in black skin. So I did a lot of album covers. Of course, I also met a lot of the musicians and went to recording. So it was really like
What a great life.
It was a great life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So tell everybody a little bit about what you're doing today, what you're working on. I know you're doing a lot of teaching. You're doing you have some videos, and you have a course or a online learning program.
Yes. Well, basically, I'm doing, actually less traveling teaching than I've done in the past. I love our house and the studios, and still trying to learn how to paint and experimenting. I just did a large, for me, 29 by 24 still life for the Prix de West show this coming June, which was kind of an unusual composition. I mean, something I just experimented with, and at times I hated the painting, or I thought I was, too far out.
Right.
And other times I thought it was interesting. Sherry loves it. She kept me going on it when I thought this is silly. But anyhow, still trying to learn how to paint, how to put things down simpler, more direct, more powerfully.
Do you ever do any dogs anymore?
No, I've done horses, but not dogs. Not dogs.
No, I don't mean paint dogs, but I mean, do you ever have paintings that you just... Yeah, I know. Joanne Manji does dogs. I know you were sitting in her workshop last night trying to learn from her. No, but what I mean is, do you ever have paintings that you just say, this didn't work, I'm going to burn it, or?
Well, I have, sometimes done a portrait that I didn't really like that much and sanded it down, but not too often.
Yeah. Probably more so in the beginning.
Yeah.
Well, one of my most prized possessions is I have a painting you did in 1968. It's of two eggs. They're in a dark, you can barely see the eggs, and you made the frame. So that's something that I cherish. I'm really glad to have. Of course, I also have a demonstration you did at the Figurative Art Conference that you gave me last year, and I cherish that, so I thank you for that. I want to open up to, do we have any audience questions?
I find it speaking of dogs, to tell one story of some of the things you go through. This was early on when I thought I would be a portrait painter. That's how I would make a living.
Right, you mean commissioned?
Commissioned portraits.
Right.
And I had done maybe 2 portraits, and they were fairly successful. I think it was like $200 a portrait, and the people liked them. And then this woman, Dale Nord, came to me, and she wanted her portrait done for $300. And I started the painting of her, and it looked like her, maybe 2 sittings. But when she left, even though it looked like her, I didn't like the paint quality. It just didn't look like a painting. I was kind of falling back on my Parsons rendering type days. So I would add paint and try to make the painting interesting. And I would lose the resemblance. And she would come back for the next sitting, and then I would try to get the drawing back so it looked like her. Right. And I kept going through this, and this went on for maybe 2 months of her coming back, me getting the resemblance, and then losing it, trying to get a good painting at. Finally, I dreaded calling her, and and I had taken photographs of her, and of course, working from photographs back then, it looked like the photograph, but it didn't look like her when she came in to sit for me.
Right.
So finally, after about, as I say, a couple of months, and then I didn't call her for about 8 months, and I decided, I wiped the whole thing off, and I figured, this time I'm going to start from scratch and just do a good portrait.
Right.
And she came in, and she saw this blank tone canvas.
Yeah.
And she looked at me and she said, "You think I'm coming here just for you to practice?" Well, I felt literally about this big. It was sort of devastating. I didn't know what to say. I mean, it was like...
Did she pay you your $300?
I had a sketch and she gave me $100. I didn't have it, didn't take any money. She gave me $100 for the sketch and left the studio.
Yeah, and you had about 1,200 hours into that portrait.
And
So
I had to pick myself up off the floor.
I'm going to open it up to the audience in a second for some questions, but I wanted to ask you one other thing. You know, I was telling Sherry last night, one of my goals in life is to own one of your self-portraits. You do these amazing self-portraits. How often do you do them, and why do you do them?
Well, I try to do at least one a year. Sometimes I miss a year and maybe do more than one, but not really to keep to a. But I do it because first it's a
free model,
and second it's more that the endless patience of getting back into a pose and really working out a specific problem, you know, that you set for yourself. That it's really to learn to paint. Like one time, I wanted to learn edges, so I set myself up in a pose. But my whole purpose was to see how far, like studying for a college exam test, how far I can just study the edges as the light worked across my face and changing value as little as possible, or colors, and trying to make edges do everything, you know, change value, change the look of color. So that's the kind of thing that I do self-portraits.
So you were really using yourself for a guinea pig for experimentation.
Yeah, for learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to learn and it was really a great learning. It was amazing just getting into edges, how wonderful and how expressive, you see.
Well, one of the things, as you know, you've painted my portrait for Fine Art Connoisseur magazine, and I've been painted, 26, 28 times now that I've published. And I'm doing that because I want to promote the idea of live portraiture. As you know, when we first talked, you said, send me a photo, and I said, no, I'm coming down. Yeah. And because I want to encourage people to learn to paint from life, and I want to keep portraiture alive and relevant in today's society, which is, it's harder and harder to do. And I'm also hoping to encourage artists to do more self-portraits, because watching you, first off, it's really interesting to see the self-portrait of you when you were probably 20, 25 years old, and then to watch progression of some of the portraits over the years as you've aged and will continue to. So, and I think it's an important thing for all artists to adopt, and so I would encourage them. Do you have any words of encouragement for them?
Well, actually, just, what I was saying, Eric, that I don't do it to, in terms of expressing something about myself as much as trying to learn, like edges or the way light falls on a surface. And so it's really just to learn to paint.
Yeah.
Is why I do every painting, but as a self-portraits are kind of a unique experience.
Absolutely.
And, to do it with that purpose, I mean, it's partially recording, of course, and but it's painting for the love of
But
painting.
it also has historical significance, especially for someone like yourself who's become such a well-known and brilliant artist, and historically, you will go down in history as one of the great painters of all time. And so I think that's also a nice benefit to be able to show your life. Do we have any questions from the audience? If you step up here to the microphone, just state your name and just speak into the microphone, and David will hear you. So you guys can line up here. Here we go. Right there. Just speak right into it.
Hi, I'm Frances. You may have said this already, but do you do your self-portraits from looking in a mirror or from a photograph?
From looking in a mirror. Yeah. Essentially, everything I do is from life.
All right.
I'm Stephen Hill. I'm an inveterate pastel artist. Do you ever work at that medium?
I haven't worked in pastel for years and years.
I'm Bladen.
Lydia Velarde. Lydia Velarde. Well, thanks for sharing your history and your talent. My question is, at this point in your career, do you still have a daily schedule for painting, or do you? How often do you paint?
Well, I try to paint every day, but life sometimes gets in the way. You know, you have to go to the cleaners or this or that. I mean, Sherry, of course, is invaluable in doing a lot of the daily things, but I do try to get into the studio almost every day, except during football season when I have to watch the NFL on Sundays or sometimes Saturdays. But
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Stacy Evangelista. On average, how long do you spend on a painting?
on a painting, a particular, it's really hard to say. It depends on the size and how intricate. The still life that I mentioned, I just finished for the Prix de West show, I worked on for a couple of weeks. But it depends on the particular painting.
I'm Edna Blanchard, and I was wondering if all of your backgrounds are mainly dark.
You know, that's an interesting question because a lot of my backgrounds aren't dark, and I remember, the same thing with Rembrandt, hearing how dark his backgrounds are, and when you look, a lot of them are not dark at all, but I think that the light is so brilliant in his paintings that we sort of pass over the background and not really notice how much light is in the background. So while I do have dark backgrounds, they're not really what I would say dark.
I am Clelia, and I'm a great admirer, and I have purchased your book, and I would love it if you could sign it for me.
That's an interesting question. I have no answer.
Well, we'll have David available to sign books. And David, where can people find your books and your videos, et cetera?
At Bright Light Fine Art.
BrightLightFineArt.com,
I guess.
All right. Well, David, this has been a pleasure. You're the second person I've ever interviewed live in front of an audience, and this has been a fabulous experience. I'll remember this for the rest of my life. God bless you.
Hopefully it'll be as long as mine and longer.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank
So
you.
how about a round of applause for David? So thank you again, David. This podcast was sponsored by Plein Air Magazine's Fall Color Week this October in Banff and Lake Louise in the Canadian Rockies. Learn more at Fall Color Week, and also fallcolorweek.com, that is. And also the interview was sponsored by the Figurative Art Convention in Miami, which David graced our stage last year, and so did Sherry, his wife, Sherry McGraw. It's a week of learning and a lot of fun. Also, if you've not seen my blog where I talk about art and life, it's called Sunday Coffee. You can find it at coffeewitheric.com. And I've got a brand new book out. Yay! It's called Make More Money Selling Your Art. And we'll tell you more about that in the future. Plein Air movement is red hot, and painting is a lifetime growing experience. So we hope you've enjoyed this. My name is Eric Rhodes, founder and publisher of Plein Air Magazine. Remember, it's a great big world out there. Go paint it. Bye-bye.